We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. It's our Friday weekend edition, and today it's going to be mostly presidential politics and Supreme Court, but I have a couple of other things to bring up here in the first segment. And one is something that the Obama administration did that we can actually applaud, because Congress passed and President Obama had signed into law something that required the Secretary of State, John Kerry, to declare by yesterday whether Islamic State was committing genocide against several Christian and religious groups in the Middle East. We thought that deadline would come and go, but it didn't. John Kerry actually declared yesterday morning that in his view, the Islamic State, which he called Daesh, is committing genocide against Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims. And it's just good that he made that declaration. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference in what our military does, but it is a signal to them that we actually are looking at this and that we care. And I think it signals sort of a path for perhaps a future administration. And then something else which I'm going to discuss with my co-host, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, and the Heritage Foundation's Daily Signal came out with something that said, well, it really asks the question why Ireland's economy grew by 8% in 2015. And on their index for economic freedom, Ireland is number 8, which is well ahead of the United States. With me now to discuss these and everything else today is Dr. Merrill Matthews. He's a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And he's been our co-host on Fridays for many, many years. Hasn't been in for a while, but I've known him a long time. He's a health policy expert, among other things, and certainly a political expert. He serves as vice chairman of the Texas Advisory Committee of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and he is prolific writer. He writes for Rare Pieces, which I'll ask him about. It's owned by Fox Media, and he's syndicated in that. And he writes articles that appear in the Wall Street Journal and Investor's Business Daily and lots of other places. And Dr. Matthews, thank you so much for being with me today.
It's good to be back with you, Penna.
It's so good to have you. And I have lots of things to kind of throw at you. First of all, what's your reaction to Secretary of State Kerry actually calling what's going on in the Middle East what it is, genocide?
Well, it's just recognizing the obvious, is it not? I mean, this has been really the case against Christians and Yazidis for some time. And some of the stories that emerge from, especially the ladies who have been involved in that and managed to get out or something like that, who've been slaves and so forth, it is just heart-rending stuff. And you know that they're going after Christians and other minorities, but not just other religions. They are also targeting Muslims in this.
And people have been forced over the last year and a half or so to actually leave communities that were really early Christian communities in the Middle East that even predate the New Testament, and people, Jewish communities that became Christian communities. And some of these have been wiped out of all Christians. We're seeing this fleeing of the Middle East. And so I think this is a good, it's not like we're going to all of a sudden change our foreign policy, but it's a good move by the Secretary of State.
Well, it is, and I think he was getting some pressure to do that, but it's simply stating the obvious, and we'll see what comes from it. But nobody, I think, really expects, as you suggest, the administration to really change its policies right now.
Yeah, okay. And on Ireland, yesterday, of course, St. Patrick's Day. And, we've watched Ireland. Sometimes they are very conservative in their policies, and they got really burned in the financial meltdown. But according to the recently published 2016 Index of Economic Freedom, which the Heritage Foundation puts out, Ireland is the world's 8th freest economy, and we're way down. We're past 10. We used to be near the top. And so they've made some good policy choices, haven't they?
They have. They lowered their corporate business tax down to 12.5%. The United States has got the highest corporate tax in the world at 35%. So Ireland is significantly lower. A lot of companies moved to Ireland, set their headquarters up there during the 2000s, that helped sort of create something of a bubble there just because you had so many companies going there. So when the recession hit, it hit them hard. And the European Union they were so outraged at the low tax rate in Ireland that they were saying, we'll help you out financially, but only if you raise your taxes. And Ireland, I think, generally sort of opposed that and fought that. I believe they managed not to do that. But yeah, they're coming back because they still have a very good corporate tax rate, and it's a very attractive place for companies to go.
Ireland's economy grew by 7.8% in 2015.
Which is better than China.
Amazing. It makes them the fastest growing economy in the European Union. It's nice to have a success story there. Well, Dr. Matthews, we are going to talk about the Trump phenomenon and just unpack a little of what happened this week and what's coming. And so I do want to talk to you about the presidential race and also the judicial nomination that took place this week. But on presidential politics, since you are really a go-to person for us on healthcare issues, and, you know, Donald Trump, he's just vague on everything, but he has talked about single-payer healthcare being good. And then he says that we need to get rid of Obamacare. Those are about the two big things that we know. But I think you know a little bit more about what he said about healthcare. I know it's not much, but just kind of bring us up to speed.
Well, Donald Trump released a 7-point plan, if you want to call it that, but it's not really much of a plan. It's more of a 7 points, of which there's just not much there. He does highlight several things that Republicans want to do. The General Republican Board will pay, like block grant Medicaid to the states, end Obamacare, though at one point he liked the health insurance mandate that required people to have health insurance. He seems to have backed off that now, perhaps. But he has some other points in there, for instance, and this is a standard Republicans thing, allow people to buy health insurance across state lines. The problem is that is not as easy to do as either Republicans or Donald Trump thinks. And that's because these days health insurance comes with a provider network that is local to where you are. And so if I am living in Texas and I see, well, here's a great policy being sold in, say, Utah, how do I buy that health insurance policy that's available in Utah where the provider network is Utah-based? It isn't Texas-based. That creates a real problem for this. So I've actually been a supporter of being able to do this, but we always, when we were doing this, we were highlighting that some states impose mandates and requirements that other states didn't. That drove up the price of health insurance. Obamacare, because it's made every plan comprehensive, it sort of has tapped that down some. The differences are not as great. But in addition, if you're living in areas that are close to each other, if you're in Kansas City where you have two states connecting to each other, it makes a certain amount of sense to be able to buy a health insurance policy available to somebody in the other state. But it doesn't make much sense for somebody in Missouri to buy a policy based in Washington, or for someone in New York to buy one based in Texas. So it's not a bad idea. It just doesn't solve many problems.
Well, you know, I wonder, too, if that's the real fix. I mean, even Marco Rubio, when he was running, would use that as, you know, sort of his plan to fix it.
Ted Cruz.
There's just so much more that needs to be done to fix it.
Much more that needs to be done.
And we're coming up on the end of the segment. And in just a moment, Tim Graham from the Media Research Center is going to join us. We're going to talk about this nominee that President Obama has put forth for the Supreme Court and how the media is treating him and portraying him. A little bit later, I'm going to ask you some more about this healthcare plan that Donald Trump has put out, and you know how he's sort of gotten away with some of his rhetoric. That happens on every subject. We'll do all of that and more right after this. Stay with us for more of Point of View. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Why do so many candidates talk about their humble upbringings and sometimes even pretend to be poor? Let's face it, most of the presidential candidates this year are quite rich. They pay more in taxes each year than most of us make in a year. Still, they tell us a story that sounds like it was taken from a biography of Abraham Lincoln. Other commentators have noticed this. Victor Davis Hanson refers to them as log cabin candidates, and Ian Tuttle says those pretending not to be rich are poor-mouthing. Sometimes it gets a bit irritating. Bill and Hillary Clinton are easily worth more than $100 million, but you wouldn't know it from some of the things she said about her finances. She graduated from Wellesley College and Yale Law School and grew up in the affluent suburb of Chicago. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio talk about their impoverished fathers, but Ted Cruz is a graduate of Princeton University, Harvard Law School, and his wife worked at Goldman Sachs. Marco Rubio's dad may have been a bartender, but he used some of his $800,000 book advance to buy a 24-foot boat that he always wanted. John Kasich has served as both governor and U.S. representative. He's also a former investment banker and regional director of Lehman Brothers, yet he nearly always mentions that his father was a mailman. And let's not forget Barack Obama, who talked about and wrote about his Kenyan father who abandoned his family. He rarely mentions that his grandparents were well off and that his grandmother was a Bank of Hawaii vice president. For some reason, politicians think they have to pretend they aren't rich. But there is one major exception, Donald Trump. He has done quite well this campaign season and certainly does not hide the fact that he is rich. If anything, he brags about it. Perhaps the other candidates should learn from him and stop pretending what they aren't. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Now playing rated PG, miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter, and Dr. Merrill Matthews is with me in studio. And you probably have not missed the news that President Obama has actually named a nominee to replace Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about whether that's even going to be considered under his administration. The Republican senators seem to be standing fairly strong against that. But I think his strategy, Buddy, was to pick somebody that was seen as a quote-unquote moderate by some people and really push that line so that the Republicans not voting would look very obstructionist. What do you think?
I think that's right. Though regardless of who they pick, they would have made the case that the person's a moderate, a consensus builder, moderate, thoughtful, and so forth, because they said that about Ruth Bader Ginsburg back when when she was nominated, when Clinton nominated her in the 90s. So they say that about all of them, but it turns out not to be the case.
Well, the media, for the most part, has been cooperating, at least the mainstream media, with the Obama administration on this line about him being a moderate, and his name is Merrick Garland. With us to discuss this is Tim Graham from the Media Research Center. And Tim, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, sure.
It's good to have you, and just kind of give us a couple of examples of the way the television networks have been treating the news this week that President Obama actually did nominate Merrick Garland.
Well, we had our Scott Whitlock here looked at all of them. I went looking for labels and found that there were 9 examples of them describing Garland as a moderate, and only 2 describing him as a liberal, and another 2 that somehow used both, where he was a moderate liberal or a liberal moderate. But this is, as you suggested, a pattern that they have used over and over again. Some of us who've been around here long enough remember they very much presented Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a centrist or someone who had a conservative approach to judging. They did this with Stephen Breyer. And
this is almost laughable.
Yeah, and it's much worse, I think, just with the last few, because they said it about Elena Kagan when it was quite obvious that she had been Obama's, counsel, Solicitor General. Quite obvious that she wasn't being a conservative in any way. Sonia Sotomayor is presented as a conservative or a centrist. And yes, I think at this point, every time they tell us this, you just have to say they're unserious. They are, they're not saying something they can prove. They're saying something that they've been, handed a cue card and told to read.
Newsbusters puts up, tries to inform us and give us some balance on this, Tim. And I've got some articles in front of me, and I know Dr. Matthews does too. But it's just very interesting to go, whether it's the New York Times, CNN, NBC, whatever, that they basically don't analyze the situation at all. They just parrot this moderate line, don't they?
They're it's very good for them. They're very easy for them to take what the spin of the day is, which is, well, this doesn't look good for the Republicans. They look very unreasonable. And Chuck Todd went so far as to say that the Garland nomination was perfect. It was perfect. It not only it was pretty good, it was perfect. And so they couldn't do any better in any way. And we had on CBS, of course, they had because it wasn't enough to say it, they had it in big letters on the screen, a moderate choice underneath a picture of Garland. And so it is one of those things that just makes you think this is advertising. It doesn't look like news to me.
But Tim, let me toss this out. In fairness to the media, most of the mainstream media are so far left that Judge Garland does look moderate to them. I mean, one could make the case that they're not necessarily trying to spin something, but from their standpoint, he does look moderate.
Well, that is an argument you can make, and certainly, look, we've done this for many years, where we pulled apart newspaper stories on groups like the Family Research Council versus groups like the, National Organization for Women. And I read, one of the things I did early on is I actually went through 700 newspaper stories on Now, and they used the word liberal twice. Right? And the Family Research Council is described as conservative more than 40% of the time in stories. There's nothing wrong with using the C word. It's just that, there's just,
it's almost like dismissing them or marginalizing them.
You could argue that these people are blind to their own bias, but that's not really an argument. You're basically like saying, the lawyer doesn't know he's being completely unprofessional. Well, no, at some point you demand that a lawyer has to observe certain rules or he doesn't get to practice. Reporters, if they can't acknowledge or imagine their own biases, then they're not journalists. They're just people who talk on TV.
Well, speaking of media bias, Tim, let me just ask you about Donald Trump. And thank you so much for joining us. But in a sense, even now, there have been pieces this week about Fox News upholding Donald Trump, giving him an easy time of it. So do you think that, along with other people in the country who are sort of accepting Donald Trump as a possible nominee or probable, Fox News is doing that too?
I think there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who are not supporting Donald Trump who feel that Fox News has let them down. There's a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump who no longer go to the Drudge Report. There's a lot of people who don't like Donald Trump that can't stand Breitbart anymore. Has Fox News promoted Trump? Clearly. Now, the only argument you can use is Fox News has given airtime to Rubio. The Fox News gave airtime to Ted Cruz. But sometimes when you turn on TV, I was in a hotel this weekend, and Fox News for an hour was talking about Trump with the graphic on screen saying, awaiting Trump rally. Like, this is the only thing going on in America today, is we're all awaiting a Trump rally. And I said, I tweeted out, sometimes you think the motto fair and balanced has been replaced by awaiting Trump rally.
Well, Tim, before Donald Trump announced, Greta Van Susteren used to have him on, I would say, roughly every other night, if not every other night, then every third night. And it got so I just got tired of watching it. Sometimes I was at the gym when he would come on, and I just tuned it out because he never had anything to say. But I was just amazed at how often they had him on when he was not a Fox News contributor. He wasn't a paid person, as many of them are. He was just on all the time.
Yeah. Well, and this is where you can argue, too, that Fox clearly has made Trump a more acceptable persona in conservative circles by constantly having him on. I know he was a routine call in to the Fox and Friends people. And so, the funny thing about this, I guess, in one sense, is you certainly can't argue that Fox News is dominated on Trump and nobody else is. I mean, the problem here, as usual, is that Trump's dominating all media. He is the king of all media, not Howard Stern. But this is the interesting part is that, even in our writing about the media, I have to say to people, I don't want 90% of our articles to complain about the 90% dominance of Donald Trump.
I understand. Well, let me ask you this.
Something else to say.
How does the media treat Donald Trump in their discussions of him? Do they consider him a conservative? Do they consider him a moderate? How do they treat him?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that they very much like the idea that Trump is the natural result of, Republican Party strategies of the last 20 or 30 years. They want to say Trump appeals to racism and xenophobia, and these are things that the Republicans have been encouraging for decades. So I think they do want to say he appeals to conservatives, and he does to some. But, obviously I think they also know from trying to pin him down on anything is he's not a man of substance. He doesn't answer questions. And they can clearly look at his record and see this is a man that donated to Hillary Clinton, the Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation, and lots of liberal Democratic politicians. He took lots of liberal positions on television. So, the irony of all of this is to say anybody who would say, if you're going to be a conservative, you have to support Trump, is somebody who hasn't really looked at who Trump is.
Good point. Listen, thanks, Tim, so much for being with us and all the work you do there at the Media Research Center.
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can go to pointofview.net. You can find one of the articles we put up that really addresses the topic that we've been talking about with Tim Graham. Network evening newscasts paint Garland as moderate. There are lots of articles about that. We put that one up. Dr. Merrill Matthews is with us, and we're going to open up the phones next segment, 800-351-1212. Everything we put on the table so far is fair game. We're going to move back to presidential politics. And, one of the questions is, can we stop Trump?
Columbia Pictures presents, in association with Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. When 10-year-old Anna Bean develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are everywhere.
Then, after Anna has a freak accident, a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner, now playing. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. More information is available at miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
How critical is the 2016 election? Well, the next president will very likely appoint at least 2, even 3 Supreme Court justices. Our on-budget debt is approaching $20 trillion, and the threats of war and terrorism all too real. Given these things, we're asking you to pray for our nation and to educate and encourage others to get involved. Sign up today at pointofview.net. We'll send reminders to help you pray, organize, and vote. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. The future of America is at stake. We need to pray. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Penna Dexter.
As usual, on Friday, we're going to need a shoehorn to get everything in. During the break, I got a few more things I want to ask Dr. Merrill Matthews about. He is my co-host today on the program. And as I mentioned earlier in the program, he's a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And he's an expert on healthcare, not only on medical ethics, but also on medical policy. And so I have a lot of phone calls coming in, and we will take your calls. The number is 800-351-1212. And you're going to hear me calling Dr. Matthews Buddy, because that's what I'm used to calling him. But Buddy, Donald Trump has spoken to the healthcare issue in various ways. He's put out a policy plan, but some of his plan isn't really a change from what we've got now.
No, there's very little in there that's a change. For instance, he says in his plan, I believe it's the third point, he wants to allow people to have health savings accounts. Health savings accounts have been a Republican mainstay now for about 25 years. But we passed health savings accounts in 2003. They've been law for 13 years. So I'm not entirely sure what he means when he says he wants to allow people to have them. They can have them now. There's about 14 million HSAs out there. They hold about $24 billion right now. If he were to say, I want to expand them because they have some limits on there, we want to allow people to have a HSA without having to buy health insurance or something like that, then that would make perfect sense. That's a reasonable approach. But he doesn't say that. He just says he wants to allow people to have HSAs. He also says in there that he wants to allow the federal government to negotiate with drug companies to try to lower the price of prescription drugs. Right now, we have the Part D plan in Medicare. That has worked exceptionally well. That provides a prescription drug benefit for seniors. I didn't like the plan. I opposed it, but it has worked well, and it's kept prices lower than most people have would have anticipated, in fact, than the federal government estimated when they initially passed this. So why you would want the federal government, which doesn't actually negotiate prices in healthcare, the federal government comes in and says, this is what we will pay you. That's what happened in Medicare, what happens in Medicaid. It is one of the reasons why Puerto Rico is going broke, because 2/3 of their people are either on Medicare or Medicaid, and the federal government pays doctors much less in Puerto Rico than they pay for Medicare and Medicaid than they pay in the United States. And as a result of Puerto Rico's $73 billion in debt, I think $25 billion of it's for Medicaid money they've needed for Medicaid. And doctors are leaving. New York Times reported back in December, 3,000 doctors, I believe, have left Puerto Rico in the last few years simply because they can't make enough money. They've come to the mainland. It is a mess, and you don't want the federal government coming in and requiring that various prices be accepted.
You know, what you delineate as far as policy and Donald Trump is way more information than he would ever articulate on a debate stage or in a speech or in an interview or whatever. It's way too much policy. That's not the way he operates his candidacy right now,
and
whether or not he stands for those things.
Typically, you think candidates should know something about policy. Whether you were listening to Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, these people knew something about the policies that are out there. Donald Trump's been able to get by without doing that, just essentially saying, it's going to be great, it's going to be fantastic, everybody will like it, and it has worked for him so far.
We've got some Trump supporters on the line. I believe, at least from what our call screener has been able to delineate from those calls. Let's go to one. Mike in South Carolina. Hi, Mike. Thanks for calling in.
Hey, I appreciate your shows. I'm thinking that mainstream media has, I think, got the Trump supporters figured wrong.
Are you a Trump supporter?
I am now. I mean, I was with Cruz, but you know, I don't know if he has a chance to do it without going to the convention and having a split convention. And a lot of Trump supporters I know, we all voted in midterm election for Republicans. And the reason they're all mad is that Republicans went up there and did nothing, you know.
Right.
So I think a lot of supporters are saying, look, you know, we want a clean house, we want to get the establishment out. And I have Democrat friends who are saying the same thing, that they're not going to vote for a Democrat that's been in there over a term, you know. They just want to get rid of the establishment. And if you look at the three candidates who are non-establishment, Trump, Carson, and kind of Cruz, if they doesn't, get to him, and the support is behind those three, and they're all anti-establishment.
That's where the country is right now.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's what they're getting to, is that, they let the voters down, and I don't think Trump's going to have all the answers right now, but any good president is going to sit down and bring in the smart people and say, all right, let's solve healthcare. Let's figure out what we need to do to make this better.
Well, Mike, let me ask you this question. I agree with you that the conventional wisdom is that a president comes in, brings in smart people to help that person make decisions. And yet, in the piece I wrote for Forbes on the Trump healthcare plan, if the person who put together his healthcare plan, the 7 points on that, was his idea of a smart person on healthcare, I'm concerned because the person doesn't know anything about it. So you may be right that if he's elected president, Trump would get in and bring in the right person to run the Department of Health and Human Services, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and so forth. But at least as evidence from what he put out on the healthcare plan, he hasn't done that yet.
Yeah, what's your opinion on Carson's healthcare plan?
Carson flipped on it. Initially, he wanted everybody to have a health savings account and have the government fund it. And I started writing a piece on that saying, my goodness, you want the government to give everybody money for health care? But over the weekend, he changed that when he was talking with Chris Wallace on Fox News. He flipped that, even though he left the YouTube thing up talking about that for a while. And then he said, well, we don't want to do that. We want to go to others. But the health savings account is fine. Expanding them is fine, but there's got to be more to it than that. That is not a healthcare solution to all the issues that we have out there.
And certainly the government funding everybody's health savings account is not a conservative solution.
That would bankrupt everybody. But making it competitive, where you can have more competition, which hopefully will lower prices. But healthcare. I got friends that they're paying $400 and $500 a month for healthcare, and it's not good. I mean, the healthcare is not good at all. You have high deductibles. And then you still have to pay 20% of the regular visit. So, I mean, it's not a good plan, what we have now.
Let me ask you a question, just a general question, Mike, because you said, well, Cruz, you were a Cruz supporter, but you don't think he can win now. But do you think Trump can get enough delegates before the convention to just take it?
No, I don't. I think the way they're pushing so hard against them and the anti-Trump, is coming out, I think he'll win probably 4 more states, but I think he'll have a lot of problems out west. But I would like to see the non-establishment candidates, Trump, Cruz, Carson, have their secret meeting, combine delegates, and tell the establishment, say, we already got somebody,
Yeah, who knows what's going to happen. Thank you so much for your call, Mike. We appreciate it. Dr. Matthews, the convention is a whole nother subject, of course, and next week there's some interesting primaries, one being Arizona, which if Ted Cruz were able to win Arizona, it might breathe some life into people like Mike who have moved from him away. The establishment doesn't like him because he's got a proven record of standing against them, unlike Trump.
And what normally happens in this case, around February or March, the voters tend to start coalescing around one person who ends up starting to just become on a roll. And that would happen with Mitt Romney and others, John McCain before that. So we'll see, because Donald Trump has been gaining some momentum here. But we'll see if he is able to sort of bring all that momentum, and reluctant voters are going to start siding with him, or if they're going to push back even more. But then there's another problem, which is under the, what do they call it? Rule 30 at the Republican Party. You have got to be able to say that you had the majority of votes in at least 8 states to be the candidate. Trump may have that. I'm not sure.
The most votes or the majority of votes?
I thought it was the majority of votes as a way of being able to push back against Ron Paul back in the 2012 election. But it may be that Donald Trump has that, Ted Cruz doesn't. And so then you have this other thing with this rule. And I was at the Republican convention when this passed, and there was outrage among a lot of people for feeling like that was just simply a way for Mitt Romney to just take over the convention and not have to deal with anybody else there. So can they repeal that? They can, but they can't until they have the various votes, the various people together to do the Rules Committee, which I think they're going to be going through that process in the next month or so.
A lot of times those rules are actually not adopted until just days
exactly
before the
right.
convention.
Yeah, they'll be meeting a week before the convention. I think the Rules Committee could probably do it before that, my understanding is, but typically those kinds of things are set up the week before the convention.
We will continue to take your calls, ladies and gentlemen, 800-351-1212. We'll take any and all supporters of any and all candidates. We'd love to hear from you. And a little bit later, we will move back to the subject of the Supreme Court nomination. We've got a lot more on that. Stay with us for more on Point of View. Pastor and author Max Lucado has written lately about decency as it relates to the presidential election. Decency is sort of a minimum demand we make on many of our relationships. Max Lucado writes of his 3 daughters and how he, quote, reserved the right to interview their dates. He'd want to know, did the young man behave in a decent manner? Would he treat my daughter with kindness and respect? Could he be trusted to bring her home on time? In his language, actions, and decisions, would he be a decent guy? Decency mattered to Max Lucado as a dad, and it matters to all of us simply in how life is conducted. For example, he writes, we take note of the person who pays their debts, the physician who takes time to listen, when the husband honors his wedding vows, when the teacher makes time for the struggling student, when the employee refuses to gossip, when the losing team congratulates the winning team. Max Lucado then pivots to the presidential race. As in other areas of life and relationship, he asks the reader, decency matters, right? He also wonders, can we not expect a tone that would set a good example for our children? We stand against bullying in schools. Shouldn't we do the same in presidential politics? Hopefully, the assault on our sense of decency that characterizes presidential politics right now will recede as the campaign season winds down. Even better when the primaries wrap up. The rough and tumble of the campaign will end and give way to our having a new president running the country. We can then expect more decorum, right? Or maybe this is a moment in our history that everything changes. Perhaps there's a political realignment taking place. Perhaps people's enduring economic pain is so deep they'll throw out certain values that used to matter. Max Lucado's blog has been quoted in at least one political campaign. But will people of faith really consider voting for someone on the basis of decency when so much is at stake? When so many people feel betrayed by their own party and its leaders? Many conservative Christian Republicans are tired of a party that voices their values and seeks their votes, but often ends up treating their concerns as a liability. Bible-believing evangelicals and Catholics are not immune to the sense of betrayal that's out there. Some are angry, and rightly so. Anger is a valid motivator in the political process, and our system allows us to channel it in constructive ways. But as one conservative, Zach Dasher, writes at Breitbart, don't be blinded by anger. Not all anger is righteous. Christians care about the economy, foreign policy, and security here at home just as much as everyone else. We are passionate about the sanctity of human life and very concerned about deviant agendas and threats to religious liberty. These things really matter. Decency also matters. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're so glad you're with us here on our weekend edition of Point of View. Dr. Merrill Matthews is my co-host. I'm Penna Dexter, and we're talking all things presidential politics, election politics today on the program, taking your calls at 800-351-1212. And before I go too much further, I want to point you to pointofview.net. You can see Dr. Merrill Matthews' picture there and some of the articles that he's written. We've put a couple of pieces up. There's so much to choose from. But one has to do with the Supreme Court. The title of his piece is Why Are Liberals Never the Swing Votes on the Supreme Court? And, you know, earlier in the program, we were talking about this whole moderate title that the media and the Obama administration are trying to make stick to the new nominee, Merrick Garland. But it's very interesting because when liberals are put up there and said to be moderates, they never stay moderates. They always move liberal.
They vote in lockstep.
Yeah, and lots of times when so-called conservatives are put up there, they get more liberal, don't they?
That's absolutely right. But the interesting thing is, and there's been some scholarly discussion among legal scholars as to how effective or what the impact of this swing vote is. But regardless of that, the media and everybody else knows there are Republican appointees who will sometimes vote with the liberals, and there never seems to be a liberal who sometimes vote with the Republicans. And one of the pieces that I linked to in the piece goes back. He said, well, I'll start with 1981. That's 35 years ago. There have been two swing votes, either Sandra Day O'Connor, a Reagan appointee, or Anthony Kennedy, another Reagan appointee.
Amazing.
That's 35 years. There have been two swing votes, and it's two Republican appointees. You go prior to that, and it gets a little fuzzier then because Democrats and Republicans, you could have conservative Democrats and you could have more liberal Republicans, and the ideology was a little less apparent when they were trying to appoint someone. But they've generally always, going back for decades, have been, if there was a swing vote, it tended to be a Republican appointee.
It's amazing that I don't forget who it was that pointed out earlier in the program that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was supposed to be a quote unquote moderate. And she was nominated.
The Wall Street Journal pointed out in its editorial yesterday that when it gave some of the language that was cited by the media, talking about her a consensus builder, she's a moderate, and so forth, it's the exact same language that they're using for Judge Garland.
She was an ACLU attorney, like head of the D.C. office or something. Let's go back to the phones. We're taking your calls, 800-351-1212. Let's go to Ryan in North Carolina. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for calling.
I just wanted to share my perspective as a young conservative who supports Trump. I think, like, I've been a traveling sales rep for the last 5 years, and I've seen a lot of towns that are desolate from, furniture being shipped overseas and various categories being shipped overseas. The company I worked for was an American manufacturer too. And I think that the most attractive thing about Trump is that he pays attention to that. And he calls out the, Nabisco and those companies that are going overseas.
But Ryan, you do know that many of Trump's products, like Trump ties, were made in China or Bangladesh. Yeah. I mean, you do know that.
Yeah, and I think that that's like a little snippet that it does make that could be a counter argument against Trump. But he also builds a lot of stuff. I don't think he's a perfect man. I just think with the given playing field, I think that he's pays the most attention to it. Talking about the car industry, Detroit. It's really, I think it's a lot worse than people notice in like DC or like in an office. So I think that that's one thing that's really attractive. Also, the political correctness. I went to a public university, and I had teachers that had, Karl Marx posters on their wall and stuff like that. So, I think that the academic political correctness is really starting to take hold of young people, and I think it's really refreshing to have a business. I think, honestly, like if it was like 80 years ago, I think that his type of patriotism would be more normal. But I think now it's like, oh, he's so bold, he's so, I call it patriotic, but some people refer to that as racism or, I don't think that he's a racist at all. I think that he's a good refreshing, breath of air, I guess, in politics now. He's not perfect. I don't judge anybody, and I don't think that any of the other candidates are terrible. But I think just like Neville Chamberlain and just like Winston Churchill, who followed him, I think that at certain times, certain people are needed.
Yeah,
and
okay, Ryan, thank you for that explanation. It's good to get sort of that reasoning coming from somebody that's younger, maybe than those of us who've been around a long time. So I appreciate your call. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Buddy?
No, I think he's tapping into this notion that it's time for something different. What I was trying to point out is what I see as the inconsistencies in Trump. Now, a lot of us are frustrated with the current with the current political status quo and what has been happening. But I just find it strange that Trump has made a lot of deals where he is having his products made overseas and brought over here and sold. And yet some of the voters who say he's going to end these things, well, when he had a chance to do it, he used the other countries. And I'd also point out, we like it when Honda or Toyota bring their factories here and build their cars here in the U.S., even though they're Japanese companies, because they feel like that's good for them to be able to sell products here. So I would argue that when Caterpillar goes and builds a plant in China, because it sells a lot of its products in China, that's as good as well. I wouldn't necessarily criticize Caterpillar for doing something like that. I just don't think Trump taps into the nuances here of why various companies do these types of things.
I think nuance would not be a word used to describe Donald Trump. And, he makes pronouncements. He actually takes positions that he may believe them or just think they're going to be the most popular because he's a populist. And he gets away with it because of the felt need out there and so many levels. And I think there was one piece that I read this week that was interesting. I didn't agree with all of it, having to do with the Reagan Democrats, this group of people. They're the people now that have seen their jobs going overseas. They've seen manufacturing leave the U.S., and that's what they were trained for. And so they're left out in the cold, and many of them have been for decades, for generations. And so, all of these needs, he speaks to them. We who have been in politics a while and who are maybe focused more on the policy, we don't see how he can get there. We don't understand that. We don't really think he can, and he probably can't.
I understand Ryan's frustration. What I'm puzzled at is the Ryans of the world don't turn around and say, but he did these other things which are completely inconsistent with what he's saying right now, and they'll gloss over that. And that's what really puzzles me, because typically in presidential campaigns, if you're saying something now, but you did something completely different in the past, it raises red flags among people. But it doesn't seem to do that with Donald Trump.
All right, before we really don't have time before, I guess, the break. We've got a long break coming up. But ladies and gentlemen, stay with us because we're going to pick up on these themes. After the break, we're going to continue to take your calls. We've actually got a full bank of phones. This is a topic that's really generating some interest. But we do also want to talk a little bit more about the convention because Dr. Matthews has put a piece up, and you can see it at pointofview.net, that also talks about, it's actually his blog. It's a blog post, very short and easy to read. But it talks about the possibilities that might take place if Donald Trump gets to the convention with not quite enough votes to be the nominee, and then we start having a contested Republican convention, and the party does not go with him. What does he do? And this piece makes the case that it would be possible for him to then go to another party, a third party at that time, which is something we haven't talked about. We'll do that after the break. So join us again after this long break, and we'll be right back.
Is it just me, or does this year's election seem more contentious than ever? Even Christians are divided between which candidate to support, but one thing we must agree upon is the need to pray together. Each and every one of us must be on our knees asking God's mercy. Who is the right one to name the next Supreme Court justice, or 2 or 3? Honestly, I don't know, but God does. And we must petition him to act. Point of View has created its own campaign in the midst of the presidential campaign, Pray, Organize, Vote. We want to remind you of things to pray about. We want to help you educate fellow believers and get them out to vote. Sign up today at pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, and Vote. The future of America is at stake, and God's people are called to be good stewards of our votes. After you sign up, look at the bottom right corner for the red box that says Donate. Your gift will educate and motivate Christians during this critical time. Don't put it off. Visit now, pointofview.net.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
And Dr. Merrill Matthews, PhD, is with me, co-hosting the show today. We are so glad that you are with us for our Friday weekend edition. And Peggy Noonan, Wall Street Journal columnist, asked the question, and we've posted it: will the GOP break apart or evolve? A bigger tent, Donald Trump as ringmaster, and an animal, unlike the old elephant. Is there going to be a major realignment? Or is the Republican Party going to change? These are some of the questions she asked. You can see that at pointofview.net. We'll discuss it a little bit later. Also, later in the program, Carrie Severino will join us, and she is the policy director and chief counsel for the Judicial Crisis Network. Her article, The Moderate Are Not So Moderate, Merrick Garland, she's going to talk about that nomination and how the Obama administration is pushing that, what they're trying to do with that nomination. How should the Senate Republicans react? They seem to be standing fairly strong, Dr. Matthews, in saying we won't even hold hearings. In fact, most of the senators are saying we won't even meet with him.
Right. The 7-8 senators now, as I understand, have said they would meet. And I don't actually see a problem with senators meeting with the person. But Mitch McConnell has said that they're not going to have the hearings on this, and they're not going to move forward with a vote. And though there is some feeling in the background that if Hillary Clinton were to win, they might be willing to come in a lame duck session, and which would be end of November, first part of December, and have a vote, because they feel like that might be better than someone that Hillary Clinton would nominate, especially if the Senate turns and Democratic, which is a possibility because you've got about twice as many Republicans running for re-election in the Senate as you do Democrats.
Yeah, and they're all worried about this. I mean, they've got each senator, especially the moderate senators from states where they've got voters that are a little bit more in the middle. They've got to think about what are they going to do? What's going to be their plan? Like Mark Kirk of Illinois, he's going to meet with him because he's got these moderate voters, and he thinks that's, the way he's going to get reelected. Susan Collins in Maine, same thing.
Right. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has already a few weeks ago said that he would allow his senators to, in essence, run against Donald Trump, run ads against him and so forth, if he becomes the Republican nominee. That I think is probably unprecedented, that you would allow sitting Republican senators to essentially disassociate themselves and might actually criticize or run ads against the same party's presidential candidate.
Well, it's really all the rules are being broken here. I mean, when you think about it, here's Donald Trump, still heavy on rhetoric, as we've said, light on actual policy. So we don't even know what he'd do on a lot of things. He will not participate now in the next scheduled debate. Well, it's no longer scheduled. He's had enough power to get that debate canceled. He needs 56% of the delegates going forward to get the nomination before the convention. That's hard to do. He is the most corrupt and really unqualified candidate, a lot of people are saying, to run for the highest office in the land ever. I mean, I think that's, in a sense, indisputable. Some people don't care, though. Michael Gerson of the Washington Post said, we're seeing the offer of personal rule by someone with no discernible public virtues. That's a pretty strong statement. Gerson tends to be a little more establishment leaning, but I tend to agree with him on that. A lot of people are questioning his integrity and his morality. And he does bring a new economic agenda to the party, which, are not typical Republican planks. For instance, he's against free trade in many cases and speaks against it. Although he
says he's for free trade, he's against the agreements that we have set up so far.
He'd negotiate better deals.
He would negotiate better deals.
He would not touch entitlements. A lot of people have said that we've got to reform Social Security, or it will just not survive. He's basically a bit authoritarian in the way he speaks about government. He doesn't even consider Congress in some of the things he says. So you wonder how would he be another Obama with executive orders?
And one of the things is she doesn't draw a lot of attention from that standpoint, but she does a pretty good job on the debates. They initially were going to limit the number of debates because they didn't want her taking that risk, and her handlers came up and said, "My gosh, she does a really good job here. Let's do some more debates." But she knows policy issues pretty well, regardless of what you think of her. You put a Donald Trump in there against a Hillary Clinton, who has some of these policy issues down, names and so forth. I think it might. We don't know how this thing would go if a Donald Trump were against Hillary Clinton, but the debates might really make Donald Trump look much more shallow than I think a lot of his supporters think he is.
Well, Wall Street Journal had this piece that is called Trump's Unification Tour, was an editorial, talking about, part of it talked about Mr. Trump visiting MSNBC's Morning Joe program, and they were asking him about foreign affairs and who is he consulting with so far. And he says, I'm speaking with myself, number one, because I have a very good brain and I've said a lot of things. And then he says, I know what I'm doing. I listen to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people. So he's kind of going back on what he said, listening to himself. At the appropriate time, I'll tell you who the people are. But I speak to a lot of people. But my primary consultant is myself. And I have I have a good instinct for this stuff. Does that make you feel better?
It maybe so, but it's not the kind of thing that would normally engender a lot of voter support. But he manages to say these things and get away with them.
Yeah. Okay. I watched a little video about salesmanship and how Trump is such a good salesman. And it said the best salesman could sell you a TV without knowing anything about television. So there you go. Let's take some calls. Let's go to Jean in New Hampshire, listening in on WSEW. Hello, Jean. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, guys, and thank you so much for your program. I am very scared of Trump. He doesn't, as you've said, integrity is a question for me. I know my daughter-in-law has been in a company that has worked with his businesses in New Jersey, and they tried to stay away from him as much as possible because of his filing for bankruptcy and all of that. So integrity, honesty, the whole 9 yards that you've covered. But what I'm wanting to get your input on, and then I'll hang up, is Mike Huckabee and Ben Carson have both endorsed Donald Trump, and I didn't gather why they would or exactly where that was coming from.
So you're sure Mike Huckabee has endorsed him?
That's what I was told.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'd have to. I tried to look that up when I saw you were going to say that. I haven't been able to confirm that.
Okay,
Carson
but
has.
I know Ben Carson has, and I was just really surprised to hear that. So just wondered what your take was on that, of all of a sudden people coming out and endorsing him.
Can you hang on over the break? We don't have a lot of time. I do want to say that Ben Carson did basically said that he was offered a job in the administration. And so, that could be the reason. There could be other reasons. Buddy, do you have any thoughts?
I was mystified why Ben Carson decided to endorse him, because you don't have to endorse somebody. You can just stay quiet. But he came out and endorsed him, even to the point where the media have asked him the question about, but Donald Trump said these things about you, and they devastate you. And he agreed and said, but that's what politics is. And he has endorsed him. I'm just amazed.
Crazy year. We continue to take your calls, 800-351-1212. We'll let Jean just weigh back in before we let her go. So stay with us for this break, and we'll be right back for more of Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Why do so many candidates talk about their humble upbringings and sometimes even pretend to be poor? Let's face it, most of the presidential candidates this year are quite rich. They pay more in taxes each year than most of us make in a year. Still, they tell us a story that sounds like it was taken from a biography of Abraham Lincoln. Other commentators have noticed this. Victor Davis Hanson refers to them as log cabin candidates, and Ian Tuttle says those pretending not to be rich are poor-mouthing. Sometimes it gets a bit irritating. Bill and Hillary Clinton are easily worth more than $100 million, but you wouldn't know it from some of the things she said about her finances. She graduated from Wellesley College and Yale Law School and grew up in the affluent suburb of Chicago. Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio talk about their impoverished fathers, but Ted Cruz is a graduate of Princeton University, Harvard Law School, and his wife worked at Goldman Sachs. Marco Rubio's dad may have been a bartender, but he used some of his $800,000 book advance to buy a 24-foot boat that he always wanted. John Kasich has served as both governor and U.S. representative. He's also a former investment banker and regional director of Lehman Brothers, yet he nearly always mentions that his father was a mailman. And let's not forget Barack Obama, who talked about and wrote about his Kenyan father who abandoned his family. He rarely mentions that his grandparents were well off and that his grandmother was a Bank of Hawaii vice president. For some reason, politicians think they have to pretend they aren't rich. But there is one major exception, Donald Trump. He has done quite well this campaign season and certainly does not hide the fact that he is rich. If anything, he brags about it. Perhaps the other candidates should learn from him and stop pretending what they aren't. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Columbia Pictures and Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. How do we explain the impossible? Now playing, rated PG, miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter. So glad you're with us for the Friday weekend edition. My co-host is Dr. Merrill Matthews. We are taking your calls at 800-351-1212. And Gene is still on the line. We've been talking about Ben Carson and Mike Huckabee and others. I think Ben Carson has endorsed Donald Trump. I'm not sure what Huckabee's done, but I have heard him speak favorably. But this whole idea of endorsing a candidate that is so opposite to you morally, Dr. Matthews, what do you think of that? I think it's a very it's a perilous thing for a person to do, especially for an evangelical and especially for a minister who their people look to the minister. You can support a person in the sense that I'm American, I'm going to vote for somebody. That's reasonable. But when an evangelical goes out and endorses someone, they to some extent take on that person's character. They're making a statement about the person and their character and their policies. And then when you go out and actually stump for a person as a minister, I think you create a lot of problems. So I'm surprised to see all of that we've seen here. Even if you support Donald Trump, that's fine for a minister to support him, but I think you ought to be keeping that to yourself from a minister because it's such a divisive issue and you may end up getting burned by that. We're going to go now back to the issue of the new judicial nominee for the Supreme Court that was made by President Obama this week. And I want to introduce my guest. Her name is Carrie Severino, and she's Chief Counsel and Policy Director of the Judicial Crisis Network. And she's testified before Congress on various constitutional issues. And she also has briefed senators on judicial nominations, and I imagine she'll be involved in that this time. We're talking about the nomination of Merrick Garland. And let me point you also to pointofview.net, where her article is there. She wrote it even before the nomination. She was sort of expecting it, I think. The moderates are not so moderate, Merrick Garland. And Carrie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
He's not so moderate, is he?
Yeah, no, it keeps me being amazed, the number of people who will repeat this line. I think just the Senate, the president is trying to never mention the word Garland without the word moderate in the same sentence. But if you look at his record, it looks like he would vote absolutely in lockstep with every other liberal justice on the court, even the New York Times, who obviously, has no vested interest in trying to argue against Judge Garland. They put him, in their estimate, slightly to the left of Justice Kagan. And we know she's absolutely on the liberal end of the court. They said if he's confirmed, it would be the most liberal Supreme Court we've seen in half a century. Now, that doesn't sound to me like a moderate.
No, it doesn't. And, when you think of some of the cases that are going to be before the next court, it just sort of reminds us for what's at stake here. I mean, gun rights, Second Amendment is at stake soon before the court. Affirmative action, abortion, campaign finance, the death penalty. It matters who's on the court, doesn't it, Carrie?
Oh, absolutely. Look at some of those issues you mentioned are being heard at the court right now. And if they're decided by a 4-4 vote, very possible, those same cases we're seeing right now may be reheard in next term or in a future term when we have that ninth justice on the court. So next week will be the Little Sisters of the Poor case that's being argued at the Supreme Court to see whether the government can force nuns and other religious nonprofits to provide contraceptives, including abortifacient contraceptives, to their employees. This is a case that actually he voted in one of the 7 consolidated cases, the Priests for Life case. He seems to think that this isn't a problem. And I think that sends us a real message on one of the major issues before the court today. The court heard earlier this month in a big abortion case having to do with whether abortion clinics can be held to the same health standards as other outpatient surgical clinics. There's a real chance the Supreme Court will decide that and say you can't make reasonable health limitations on abortion clinics. But even if they don't, that 5th vote would be decisive, and that could mean a real pushback to eliminate all restrictions on abortion, even these common sense health restrictions. So there's so many issues. You mentioned the Second Amendment. That's another one that Judge Garland has had cases that he decided that suggest seems like he doesn't even believe we have a Second Amendment right to have a gun in your house just to protect yourself. That's pretty extreme, I think, and I don't think that's the kind of person the American people are going to be comfortable having interpret the Constitution on the court for the next generation.
Carrie, I wrote a piece that came out today in Cox Media. It's the Rare website, rare.us. But I looked back over this, and I was looking at the issue of the swing vote, and one of the law journals, Hofstra Law Review, had an article from a legal scholar looking back at the 5-4 swing votes, and he pointed out that in between 1901 and 1900, a little over 2% of the votes among the Supreme Court were 5-4 decisions. Between 1991 and 1991 and 2000, it was nearly 25%, like 23% of them were swing votes, 5-4 decisions. And the point he's trying to make is that 5th vote there can really make a lot of difference now, much more so than it might have 100 years ago.
Absolutely. And we've seen in some recent years where there's been into the 40% of cases that are 5-4
right,
decisions.
That was an average over that decade, but he pointed out that in some years it's much higher.
Yeah, and I think that's because the court, unfortunately, has kind of politicized itself. Every time the court does something like it did in Roe versus Wade, where it takes something the Constitution doesn't really speak to. The Constitution doesn't say, do women have a right to have an abortion? Does a child have a right to life? The Constitution doesn't speak on that. The states used to have the ability to make that decision. You would have that decision at the ballot box with your elected representative. The court took that away from the democratic process. I think it did the same thing with marriage, recently, where this is something, again, the Constitution doesn't speak to the issue. The court inserted itself into there by taking an issue and putting it in the Constitution. Every time it does that with these political issues, it makes the court more political, and that's really unfortunate. It also means that we see more division on the court, like you pointed out.
Carrie, I'm glad we have you on because I know that, and we had someone from the Media Research Center earlier in the program to talk about what the media is doing, and they're really taking this moderate label of Judge Garland and running with it. And so people need to understand, who this man is. And, he was a chief judge of the D.C. Circuit for many years. And he was also, before that, a Justice Department lawyer, and he helped coordinate the investigation at the Oklahoma City bombing. People say that he's avoided strong ideological opinions. He's middle of the road. He's part of consensus rulings, not known as a progressive, all of that you're hearing. But you mentioned his positions on guns that are actually in the record on the Second Amendment. And also, he's been more willing than conservative colleagues to defer to the decisions of federal regulators. And that speaks to these clean water cases, EPA cases, and things like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, we've seen the EPA, especially under President Obama, get very aggressive in trying to basically take over the job that Congress is supposed to have. Our elected representatives are supposed to write the laws. And then you end up with a balance where we're balancing the issues of, we need to have energy that's affordable, that takes advantage of some of our natural resources, et cetera. And instead of having Congress do that, the EPA is trying to aggressively implement things that the president maybe wanted to get done, but that Congress didn't. And Congress said, no, we don't want to enact that. Well, the president will just have the EPA do it. What concerns us is that then if you have judges that just defer to the EPA and say, well, we'll just go with what the EPA says the statute means, that's basically abdicating your duty. Your duty as a judge is to interpret the law, not to just rubber stamp whatever the administrative agency does. And that goes for the EPA, that goes for the NLRB and its labor decisions, that goes for the IRS. It's really a problem when we have all of the things this president is trying to get around our elected representatives to do, and to have someone else on the court who looks like they would just greenlight that kind of abuse of executive power, that's really worrisome, too.
And, Carrie, one of the things you're sort of alluding to is that there's a growing federalism movement in the U.S., has been since President Obama was elected, in which we're saying, the Constitution just doesn't give Congress or the federal government the power to do this. Therefore, it belongs to the states and not the federal government. But with someone with Merrick Garland's background, they don't find anything that the federal government should not be doing, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's a real worry because we have a government of limited powers. We have a government that's supposed to leave these things to people. And I think when it does, it also gets an answer that addresses and balances all the issues at the table. That's, again, we talked about the HHS mandate. That was another thing done by an agency. When you have these laws done at a level where it's your elected representatives, they often take into consideration important things like religious freedom. They might take into consideration on these EPA things, is this going to destroy jobs? Is this going to drive energy prices through the roof? The bureaucrats making up these rules, they don't have to consider that because they're not accountable. And I think that's a real problem. And if the judiciary abdicates its role and just says, well, we'll go with whatever you do, that's not making the tough decisions we put them there to make.
Carrie Severino, Judicial Crisis Network, thank you so much for joining us today.
Have a great day.
We'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. Full bank of phones. We'll take your calls. Most people want to weigh in on Donald Trump, one way or the other. We'll be right back.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Penna Dexter.
And Dr. Merrill Matthews, and this is our Friday weekend edition. We are talking about presidential politics and taking your calls. I promised we would get to more of them during this segment, and we are going to do so. Let's go to Gail now, calling in from South Carolina. Hi, Gail. Thanks for calling.
Hi, Penna. Yeah, thank you guys for doing what you do. Just talking about Donald Trump, I don't know and cannot in my mind understand any evangelical that say they would support this man. He has, in my opinion, no kind of morals. He says whatever comes to mind. He stomps around like a 2-year-old. You know, this is not what we need to run our country. He's not presidential material, you know, and I really am disheartened when I hear that Dr. Ben Carson came out and endorsed him. I didn't expect much difference from Governor Christie of New Jersey, because he, in essence, is another Donald Trump. He stumps around when he doesn't get his way. We need someone with a clear mind, someone with policy, someone that knows foreign policy that runs the government. And Donald Trump is not it. I mean, this man is unscrupulous. I mean, he doesn't care what he does. I first heard about Donald Trump when I read an article about him doing an eminent domain to take the property of some old woman where he wanted to put up a building.
And Gail, Donald Trump is still something that most conservatives and liberals, it allows it, but we don't really like it property when they don't want to sell. But Donald Trump has used.
And that she brings up about evangelical. Just wondering about it. I'm starting to get an answer gelling in my mind, and let's see if both of you, Gail and also Buddy, agree, because we're hearing that much of his appeal is to sort of that constituency of people who either have lost manufacturing jobs because manufacturing has gone overseas, maybe young people who have graduated college with a mountain of debt and no job, living at home, just people that aren't doing well in this economy. And some people have called a lot of that the Reagan Democrat. So you have these people, it's a felt need, and this need becomes so important in a person's life that they're looking for this to be met. And also people who just don't feel protected from illegal immigrants or Muslims, radical jihadists coming into the country. So they see all of his positions as helping them and protecting them against that. And so this, to use the word Trump, I guess in a different way, this trumps their moral positions on issues. This trumps their desire to have a decent, godly candidate. Right now, they just want someone that's going to save them from the pain they're in. What do you think?
I think it's as good an analysis as anybody has done, and most of us don't really know. But it certainly seems to be the case that a lot of people are afraid out there. There's a lot of fear, high anxiety, and they are willing to go with someone who they wouldn't normally. But you know, Penna, I go back to this issue again of it's one thing to say, I think this person can solve the problem. It's another thing for evangelicals to go out on the stump, to go to states to prominent evangelicals, Jerry Falwell Jr. and others, making the case that this is the person we should be following. I'm mystified by that.
Gail, what do you think?
I'm mystified. I mean, first and foremost, my allegiance is to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And if Donald Trump was the last person running, I would not support him just because of my beliefs. I could not support this man. I don't care if I had lost 10 billion jobs. No.
Yeah. And
I understand Gail's position. I can understand the position of somebody who says he is the nominee and he's better than Hillary Clinton, so I'm going to do that. And I may or may not agree with him, but I understand that. I don't understand why you go on the stump for the person. That, especially from an evangelical standpoint, I don't understand that.
Gail, thanks for your call. We appreciate it. Let's take another one. Let's go now to Dwayne in Georgia. Hi, Dwayne. Dwayne, I'm sorry I got you locked in now. You need to start over because I kind of didn't have you there.
Okay. I agree with the previous caller. We need to vote for someone who has previous political experience in office, and that's the reason why I voted for Ted Cruz here in the state of Georgia. I'm sorry he didn't win Georgia. It would have been nice that he did. This
he needed
Donald
it.
Trump. Yeah, Donald Trump don't have no previous political experience. All he know how to do is operate businesses, and people need to start paying attention to statements he made. He had in a recent debate, I think it was Megyn Kelly that was interviewing him on the H-1 visas for illegal immigrants. Before then, he was against that, but when Megyn Kelly was questioning him on it, he said, I changed my mind. I changed my mind. I'm forgiving it to them now. And
which is legitimate. You can change your mind if you give a good reason for it. Mm-hmm. We've allowed our candidates to do that. We've embraced people that have moved to the conservative side of things. But I do agree with you that it's nice to have experience to show what they would really do. And to
Dwayne's point, to his point there, the Donald Trump is, if he were elected, he would be the first person who has never been elected to an office since Eisenhower. And Eisenhower got in there because he was a general and a war hero. But I don't think you can go back through the whole 1900s, and I'm not sure how far you'd have to go back to find somebody who had never been elected before to some previous office who is going to be the president of the United States. They've generally always had some electoral experience.
That's the appeal, I think, for some people. Yeah. No experience somehow qualifies them to be the nominee.
Yeah.
Thank you for your call, Dwayne. We appreciate it. Let's take another one here in this segment. Let's go to Clinton in the state of Missouri. Hi, Clinton.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for calling.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Do you have a comment on Donald Trump or the presidential primary process?
Yeah. I mean, I'm like a lot of people, I guess. I'm pretty disenfranchised with the whole political system at this point. But I mean, I'm shocked that so much of the Christian community is flocked behind Donald Trump, and I feel like it has a lot to do with the labels that we use in politics, to where the label can kind of paint these people with a brush that kind of just makes everything more black and white when it's really not as black and white as everyone seems to make it. You know, he's not really a great businessman as far as how many, Mitt Romney kind of chewed him a new one with that, under that same line of all of the failed businesses he's had. I mean, he's a reality star, and he's showing the world that he's acting like a reality star. And
Clinton, are you in Michigan or Missouri?
Michigan.
Michigan. Okay, so the primary there in Michigan. I mean, we're just talking about Reagan Democrats, people that who feel this sort of economic economic disease, really not doing well in this economy, and this is where Trump is kind of sort of coming in as a savior. Have you seen that phenomenon in the state of Michigan?
Yeah, and I think that Michigan is one of the states that has been hit pretty hard by that, especially in those southern areas. And I think it has a lot to do with the kind of runaway train that this country's kind of turned into, and the whole world's kind of turned into, a lot because of the way the corporations work, and the need for profits kind of trumps everything else, including the world, the earth, and the people on it. And that's what. And he's just dividing people within our country and without the country. I mean, there's already other countries talking about barring him from going there. So if he's the president, our president can't go to other countries for diplomatic reasons because they don't want to even have him step on their on their ground, you know. His anti-political correctness campaign is pretty much an excuse to be crass and rude and talk, you know, defame entire people, you know.
Listen, Clinton, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, sometimes it's hard to find the words to describe the situation.
Yeah,
I hear
it's hard to
Clinton
put into
doing
words.
that. Listen, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to take your calls after the break, and stay with us for more of this program that's really been run by the callers, and we're so grateful. We'll be right back. Pastor and author Max Lucado has written lately about decency as it relates to the presidential election. Decency is sort of a minimum demand we make on many of our relationships. Max Lucado writes of his 3 daughters and how he, quote, reserved the right to interview their dates. He'd want to know, did the young man behave in a decent manner? Would he treat my daughter with kindness and respect? Could he be trusted to bring her home on time? In his language, actions, and decisions, would he be a decent guy? Decency mattered to Max Lucado as a dad, and it matters to all of us simply in how life is conducted. For example, he writes, we take note of the person who pays their debts, the physician who takes time to listen, when the husband honors his wedding vows, when the teacher makes time for the struggling student, when the employee refuses to gossip, when the losing team congratulates the winning team. Max Lucado then pivots to the presidential race. As in other areas of life and relationship, he asks the reader, decency matters, right? He also wonders, can we not expect a tone that would set a good example for our children? We stand against bullying in schools. Shouldn't we do the same in presidential politics? Hopefully, the assault on our sense of decency that characterizes presidential politics right now will recede as the campaign season winds down. Even better when the primaries wrap up. The rough and tumble of the campaign will end and give way to our having a new president running the country. We can then expect more decorum, right? Or maybe this is a moment in our history that everything changes. Perhaps there's a political realignment taking place. Perhaps people's enduring economic pain is so deep they'll throw out certain values that used to matter. Max Lucado's blog has been quoted in at least one political campaign. But will people of faith really consider voting for someone on the basis of decency when so much is at stake? When so many people feel betrayed by their own party and its leaders? Many conservative Christian Republicans are tired of a party that voices their values and seeks their votes, but often ends up treating their concerns as a liability. Bible-believing evangelicals and Catholics are not immune to the sense of betrayal that's out there. Some are angry, and rightly so. Anger is a valid motivator in the political process, and our system allows us to channel it in constructive ways. But as one conservative, Zach Dasher, writes at Breitbart, don't be blinded by anger. Not all anger is righteous. Christians care about the economy, foreign policy, and security here at home just as much as everyone else. We are passionate about the sanctity of human life and very concerned about deviant agendas and threats to religious liberty. These things really matter. Decency also matters. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We continue to take your calls here at Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter. Dr. Merrill Matthews also in studio co-hosting with me today. Dr. Matthews, let's talk a little bit about the convention. We know that if no presidential candidate wins a majority of delegates, then the decision of the nominee will be made at the convention. It's called a contested convention. And so some people are worried that the party insiders will pick somebody other than what the people want. And there are rules that are made before the convention. There are all sorts of things that can happen. But right now we've got a couple of candidates that could get there with a lot of votes. Ted Cruz could get there with a lot of votes. For him to get there with the most votes is still technically possible, but very difficult.
Right, difficult.
Probably the next step that he needs to take to do that is to win Arizona. It's a winner-take-all state next week, and that would be huge. He's not ahead there right now, but, if he works really hard there, maybe he can win that state. But realistically, and Donald Trump could win it all, or he could make it to the convention without the number of delegates needed. So there's various strategies and things that people can do there. One of them, a lot of people have dismissed, but you say it's not unrealistic. Donald Trump promised not to run as an independent, but if he got to the convention with the most votes and then he ended up not being the nominee, he might take it independent, take it third party, and it's possible, isn't it?
Yes, and it could be both independent and third party. And by that, I mean, most of the states allow independents to register for the election fairly late, July